The Galactic Academy buzzed with noise as students from many worlds rushed through the long halls. It was midterm week, and everyone carried small boxes or wrapped items for their cultural assignment. The task was simple. Each student had to bring one object from their homeworld that showed something about their species' history. Many students chose decorative replicas or harmless symbols. No one expected anything dangerous. The teachers hoped this assignment would help the young alien students learn from each other without conflict. Professor Vrel, a tall, silver-skinned instructor from the peaceful planet Vesir, walked into the classroom with gentle confidence. He believed this assignment would be easy to grade. The Varian students usually brought crystal carvings. The Zyral students always presented their memory globes. Even the Karth warriors, famous for their strength, usually brought wooden training clubs used only in rituals, not real battles. Vrel liked assignments where nothing exploded, melted, or frightened anyone. Education should be calm, he often said. He checked his list. Only one student had not yet delivered his item: Mason Caro the human. Humans were still new in the academy. Most species had only known them for a few decades, and stories about humans were mixed. Some tales said they were emotional and unpredictable. Others said they were creative, brave, and stubborn in a way no other species understood. Vrel believed the truth was somewhere in the middle. But he had learned one thing: never assume you knew what a human would do. He expected Mason to bring something harmless, maybe an old photograph, a plastic toy, or a small Earth souvenir. Humans liked sentimental objects, and they enjoyed sharing stories from their home. Vrel looked toward the door as a loud scraping sound echoed through the hallway. The students turned their heads. Something heavy was being pushed along the floor. Then Mason appeared. He was a tall young man with dark hair and tired eyes, wearing the soft gray uniform of the academy. His hands were gripping the handles of a large metal crate that sat on a wheeled platform. The crate was not smooth and shiny like most storage units brought by other students. It looked old. It looked used. Deep scratches cut across the sides. The corners were bent. Burn marks covered the top like someone had tried to melt it. Every eye in the room focused on the symbol stamped in faded black paint across the crate's front panel. The class fell silent. Even Vrel felt his breath pause for a moment. Humans, he remembered, were one of the few species who had fought real wars only a few generations ago. Many young aliens had never seen a real weapon, much less something connected to an actual battlefield. The crate did not look like a harmless museum copy. It looked like history that had survived something violent. Mason rolled the crate inside, as if he did not notice the fear building around him. He parked it in front of the class and gave a friendly smile. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "This thing is heavier than I thought." None of the students moved. A Karth warrior in the back narrowed her eyes. Zyral twins whispered nervously to each other. A Varian student folded his wings tightly, as if trying to hide behind them. Professor Vrel cleared his throat and tried to remain calm. "Mason, is that your submission for the assignment?" "Yes, sir," Mason answered. "I wasn't sure if it was allowed, but it's important to my family, and it's part of human history." Vrel nodded slowly, though inside he felt a knot tightening. He couldn't stop the assignment now. Every student had the right to share their culture, and humans were no different. Still, he hoped the contents of the crate were not as dangerous as the outside suggested. Mason tapped a control panel on the crate. With a sharp click, the seal lights flashed. The lid released a hiss of air, and the top slowly lifted open. The entire class leaned back. Inside the crate rested a full suit of human combat armor. It was dark green, heavy, and shaped for a human body. The chest plate held deep dents the size of fists. The left arm guard had a chunk missing. Scorch marks stretched across the helmet as if it had survived a burning storm. Even someone who had never seen war could understand one thing. This armor had been worn in a real fight. No one spoke. Even the air felt tense. Mason reached inside with gentle hands and lifted the helmet. It looked like it might fall apart at any moment, yet he held it with care, almost respect. "This belonged to my great-grandmother," he said softly. "She wore it in Earth's last major ground war." Professor Vrel blinked. He expected a replica, a hologram, a restored museum piece. But this was something else entirely. This was real. This was history made of metal and scars. A Zyral student finally found his voice. "You brought armor? Actual battle armor?" "It's safe," Mason assured them. "There's no weapon, no ammunition, just the armor." But the aliens did not calm. Many species in the Academy had never seen war at all. Their worlds had been peaceful for thousands of years. Conflict for them meant disagreements, not bloodshed. The idea that humans kept battlefield relics in family storage was shocking. A small Varian girl raised her hand shakily. "Why is it damaged?" Mason smiled a sad smile. "Because she survived things that almost killed her." The class swallowed as one. Mason set the helmet on the table and pulled out the chest piece. The students leaned forward despite their fear. Curiosity pushed aside their discomfort. Every mark on the armor looked like a story carved into metal. "She kept this hidden in a trunk," Mason said. "After she died, my family didn't want it to be forgotten. She always told me that history is not something you hide. It's something you learn from." Professor Vrel felt the tension shift. The fear in the room was turning into fascination. The alien students began to step forward, drawn to the armor like moths to a flame. Mason continued. "I didn't bring it to frighten anyone. I brought it because humans carry our past with us, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts." For the first time since the crate arrived, Vrel relaxed a little. The assignment might have become more complicated, but something meaningful was happening. The students were not turning away. They were learning. In that moment, the armor was no longer just a relic. It was a bridge between species, between histories, between fears and understanding. And as the class gathered around, Mason's story was only beginning. The classroom stayed unusually quiet as the students gathered around the open crate. They did not touch the human combat armor, but their eyes followed every detail. Some stared in shock, others in curiosity, and a few in cautious respect. The dents, scratches, and burn marks felt like silent witnesses to events no one in that room had lived through. Mason stood beside the crate, watching their reactions with patience. He understood why they were surprised. Most species in the Galactic Academy talked about conflict only in history lessons or peaceful debates. To them, war was a distant, almost alien concept. But for humans, war had always been a heavy part of their past, something they wished to avoid, but learned from deeply. A Karth warrior student named Ralvek finally stepped closer. He was taller than everyone else, with thick scaled armor covering his body. Karth warriors trained since childhood, but their combat was ritual and controlled, nothing compared to real war. He touched one of the dents on the chest plate, and his voice came out low. "This was made by an enemy strike?" Mason nodded. "A plasma bolt." She said it hit her so hard, she didn't hear anything for a full minute afterward. The Karth's eyes widened with something like admiration. Plasma weapons were rare and dangerous. Their power was usually described only in training manuals. Seeing actual damage caused by one felt surreal. A soft voice came from behind the crowd. It belonged to Lyra, a bird-like Varian student with delicate wings that shimmered like glass. She looked at the cracked visor with concern. "Your great-grandmother wore this?" Mason smiled gently. Of course she was afraid. Every human is afraid in situations like that, but she kept moving anyway. Several aliens exchanged confused looks. They understood bravery. They understood fear. But the idea of pushing through fear, instead of running from it, seemed difficult for some to grasp. Professor Vrell stepped forward to regain the rhythm of the lesson. "Mason," he said softly, "please tell us more about this armor. You mentioned earlier that it is part of your family history?" Mason nodded, but before he spoke, he reached into the crate again. His hands came out holding a small data drive. A smooth silver device with an old Earth emblem engraved on the side. He placed it on the table next to the armor. "This contains the mission recordings," Mason explained. "My great-grandmother saved the data from her suit's system. It shows what happened on the day she took these hits." The students held their breath. This was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was a story captured in real time. But before Mason could play anything, a Zyral student named Tivik raised a trembling hand. "Before you show us the recordings, may we ask something? Humans, do many of you keep objects like this from your wars?" Mason shrugged lightly. "Some do. Some don't. It depends on the family. But my great-grandmother believed that reminders of the past help us avoid repeating old mistakes. She didn't want future generations to forget what war felt like, or how much it cost." The idea seemed to confuse Tivik. Why keep something painful? On Zyral, anything that causes fear is destroyed. We erase traumatic memories for emotional safety. Every third. Mason looked surprised but not judgmental. "Humans are different. We think pain teaches us. We think scars, physical or emotional, can guide us. If we forget our struggles, we might repeat them." The room grew even quieter. Some students nodded slowly, trying to understand. Others looked unsure, as if this human logic felt strange but not wrong. Mason opened a side compartment of the armor, revealing a small engraved plate. The words were included in English, but a translator clip projected the meaning clearly. "For the ones who didn't come home." Many students froze at that. Even without details, they understood what the words meant. Lyra covered her mouth with her feathers. Tivik's bright blue skin turned pale purple. Even Ralvek lowered his head, showing respect in the Karth way. This simple engraving made the armor feel heavier. It was no longer just an object. It represented sacrifice, loss, and memories carried across generations. Mason closed the compartment gently. She said this armor reminded her not just of battles, but of the people she fought beside, people she wanted to protect. Professor Vrell found his voice again. "Mason, would you be willing to explain the damage in more detail? I believe your classmates wish to understand." Mason nodded. He lifted the chest piece and turned it so the class could see better. "This dent on the right side happened when she shielded 2 civilians during an evacuation," he explained. "The blast would have killed them if she didn't step in front." A soft gasp went through the room. The idea of risking one's life for strangers was impressive even by alien standards. He then pointed to a long scorch line across the left shoulder. "This happened during a night attack. She said she didn't even realize she'd been hit until the fight was over." The students exchanged shocked looks. Damage like that would have put many species in medical chambers for months. "And this," Mason said quietly as he touched the cracked visor, "came from a close-range hit. She fell, but she got back up," Lyra whispered. "How?" Mason's smile held pride and sadness at once. "Because she had people relying on her." The words seemed to echo through the room like a quiet thunder. Something shifted in the atmosphere. The armor no longer inspired fear. It inspired respect. It made the aliens see humans not as unpredictable creatures, but as beings capable of great loyalty and determination. Slowly, students who had been afraid at first stepped closer. Some leaned in to look at the marks. Others asked questions. The armor had started as something frightening, but now it was becoming something they wanted to understand. Tivik pointed at the data device. "Will you show us the recordings?" Mason looked at Professor Vrell. "If it's allowed." Vrell nodded carefully. "Only if you are comfortable." The lesson today is not about fear. It is about learning. Mason connected the drive to the classroom holo projector. The lights dimmed slightly, and a soft hum filled the room. Before pressing play, Mason said, "Remember, this isn't a story told by actors. These are real memories." The students stood still, their hearts beating a little faster. Not because they feared violence, but because they sensed they were about to witness something important, something no other class in the academy had ever seen. As Mason pressed the button, the first image flickered to life. Shadows and smoke filled the screen. A distant alarm echoed, and through the visor's cracked display, the class saw the beginning of a day that had changed one human soldier's life forever. The room seemed to hold its breath. The lesson was only just beginning. The classroom lights dimmed until only the glow of the holo projector filled the room. Every student stood in silent attention, their eyes fixed on the flickering image of the battlefield, recorded through a cracked visor. The damaged lens made the view slightly distorted, but that only made the scene feel more real. It was not polished. It was not edited. It was raw memory. Smoke rolled across the ground like low-hanging fog. The air shook with distant impacts. The visor display showed shaky numbers. Heart rate rising. Armor status dropping. Mission time ticking forward. Even without sound, the students felt the tension. This was not a training exercise. This was survival. Mason watched their faces as the recording continued. He had seen the footage many times before, but it still made his stomach tighten. The voices were muted so the class would not hear anything frightening, but the visuals were enough to explain the danger. Through the visor, they saw Mason's great-grandmother, her breathing heavy, her movements sharp, her hands gripping her weapon tightly. The students noticed something important almost immediately. She was not running away. She was moving toward the danger. A Varian student whispered, "Why is she going forward? Should she not retreat?" "Why?" Mason shook his head. She couldn't. There were civilians behind her. She had to make sure the evacuation route stayed open. The visor camera briefly caught a group of scared people hiding behind broken structures. Even though their faces were blurred by the damage, their fear was clear. The armor recorded their desperate gestures pointing toward incoming threats, crying out silently through the muted playback. Lyra placed a winged hand over her chest. She was protecting them. The battlefield flickered again. The visor shook violently as something struck the armor. The class jumped as the screen blurred, tilting sideways. Mason's great-grandmother fell to one knee, her view spinning. Dust clouded the visor. A warning flashed in red across the display. Armor integrity, 47%. The Karth warrior Ralvek clicked his claws softly. In our training, anyone who reached such low protection would withdraw immediately. Mason glanced at him. She didn't have that option. When the camera steadied, the class saw her lift herself again, using a broken piece of wall for support. Her breathing was loud even through the damaged audio filter. She pushed forward, step by step. Though the aliens did not fully understand human endurance, they saw something different now. Something that was not aggression, but refusal. Refusal to fall. Refusal to leave people behind. Refusal to accept defeat even when her armor was failing. A Zyral student named Tivik leaned closer to the hologram. "How can a human stand with such damage? Would it not hurt?" Mason smiled softly. "Of course it hurt. Humans feel pain just like anyone else. But sometimes, we move anyway." The visor turned toward a blockade made of collapsed structures. The great-grandmother's hand reached out to help a young civilian climb over it. Even though the woman was clearly exhausted, she lifted others first. Only when everyone was safe did she climb after them. Professor Vrel felt something twist in his chest. He had taught at the academy for many years, but he had never seen a lesson affect students like this. The room radiated a mix of awe and quiet sorrow. These young aliens were witnessing a side of humanity that no textbook had captured. The recording shifted again. This time, a bright flash crossed the screen, followed by another violent shake. The class flinched. Black scorch marks began to appear across the edges of the display. Mason paused the recording. Everyone turned to him. "She took that hit while trying to signal the rescue ships," Mason explained. He showed them the burn mark on the armor's shoulder, gently tapping it with his knuckles. This was the moment she almost didn't get back up. The students exchanged uneasy looks. They understood, almost, in theory. But in this context, it suddenly felt very real. Mason pressed play again, but slower this time, giving them room to breathe. The visor view lay sideways in the dirt. The surroundings were blurry. A faint, trembling hand reached toward the ground, fingers digging into soil, as if searching for strength. Slowly, very slowly, the camera lifted again. A Varian student whispered, "She rose alone." Mason nodded. She had to. She said every second mattered. The camera faced the sky, where distant shapes of evacuation ships were descending, but smoke blocked their path. The class could see the great-grandmother disable a burning structure to clear a landing zone. The movements were slow but determined. Ralvek muttered, "She is hurt. Yet, she continues to fight the environment itself. Not to win," Mason corrected gently. "To save others." The difference hit the room like a silent strike. Humans were not feared because they loved battle. Humans were respected because in the worst moments, they refused to abandon hope. When the first evacuation ship touched the ground, a faint cheer, barely captured by the damaged audio, reached the class. The visor turned toward the civilians boarding the ship. The great-grandmother guided them inside, counted each of them, and only when the last one was safe did she step back. Suddenly, the screen flashed red again. Incoming impact. The class stiffened. The visor whipped around to show debris falling toward the evacuation area. Without hesitating, the great-grandmother ran forward, raising her arms to shield a family at the ship's entrance. The blow struck her armor hard, so hard the recording glitched. When the vision returned, she was lying on the ground again. But the people she shielded were alive, rushing inside the ship. Professor Vrel exhaled shakily. He felt his throat tighten. It was a strange feeling, something between fear, admiration, and unexpected pride for a species not his own. The recording ended shortly after rescue crews arrived, the camera shutting off as the armor's power finally failed. When the lights in the classroom brightened again, no one spoke. The silence was not fear now. It was respect. Deep, overwhelming respect. Mason closed the hollow projector. He did not speak immediately. He let the emotions settle. Finally, Tivik broke the silence. "Your great-grandmother, she was not powerful, she was not unhurt, but she was unstoppable." Mason nodded. "That's what she always told me. Humans don't need to be the strongest to make a difference. We just need to care enough to try." Lyra stepped forward, her wings trembling. "Mason, this is not what we thought war was. This is courage." Mason placed the cracked helmet back on the table. "This is what she wanted us to learn. War is terrible. But people can choose to be brave, even when everything around them says to give up." The aliens exchanged looks, understanding something new, something textbooks had never taught them. Humans did not admire war. Humans admired those who protected others from it. The lesson they had just witnessed was not about battle. It was about the strength of the human heart. The classroom remained silent long after the recording ended. The dim light of the hollow projector still glowed faintly, as if the memory of the battlefield refused to fade. No student dared to speak first. The moment felt too important, too heavy. Many of them had come to the academy believing humans were unpredictable creatures, emotional, intense, difficult to understand. But now, after witnessing the raw reality of one human soldier's struggle, they understood something different. Humans were not dangerous because they enjoyed conflict. They were dangerous because they refused to give up. Mason stood beside the armor, his hands resting lightly on the cracked helmet. He did not smile. He did not try to look proud. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost gentle, as though he could still feel the weight of his great-grandmother's memories. Professor Vrel finally cleared his throat, but even his voice came out softer than usual. "Mason," he began, "I believe the class would benefit from understanding something. Why did your great-grandmother keep fighting when her body and armor were failing?" Mason took a slow breath. The room waited. "She always said that humans fight hardest when we believe someone needs us," he answered. "It's not about pride. It's not about victory. It's about people." The aliens exchanged quiet looks. They understood loyalty in their own ways, but what they had seen went beyond simple duty. It was deeper, more personal. Ralvek, the Karth warrior, stepped forward. His heavy steps echoed on the polished floor. "She was not the strongest," he said, "not the fastest. And her armor was close to breaking. Yet she kept moving. Among my people, that is the sign of a true champion." Mason nodded politely. She never thought of herself that way. She only thought of the people she had to protect. Professor Vrel noticed something unexpected. The fear many students had shown earlier when Mason rolled the crate into the room had changed into admiration. Now, each student looked at the armor with new eyes. It no longer represented danger. It represented sacrifice and courage. It represented humanity's strange, powerful ability to rise after being knocked down. But Vrel also sensed there was one more lesson the students needed to learn. Something not shown in the recording. "Mason," he said, "may you share more about her final moments during that mission? Not the violence, only what she felt, what she told your family." Mason hesitated. This part of the story was always the hardest for him. But he nodded. She wrote about it in her journal. We still keep it safe at home. She wrote about it in her journal. Mason, he sat on the edge of the table, eyes thoughtful. She said that when she fell the second time, she thought everything was over. The armor was shutting down. Her body was in pain. She couldn't hear anything clearly. She thought she failed. The class tensed. But, Mason continued softly, she also saw the evacuation ship rising into the sky. She saw the people she protected. And she realized that was enough. Even if she didn't survive, they would. Lyra wiped her eyes with the tips of her feathers. So she kept fighting. Not for her own life, but for theirs. Yes, Mason said. She said that in her last conscious moment, she felt peace because she had done something good. The emotional weight settled over the room like a warm blanket. The aliens were not used to learning through painful history, but they understood kindness, courage, and sacrifice. And they recognized that humans carried those qualities in a very intense way. Tivik, the Zyral student, approached the armor slowly. Mason, he asked softly, could we examine the armor more closely? Not to touch, but to understand? Mason nodded. Of course. The students formed a circle around the armor. Ralvek studied the dents on the chest plate. Lyra traced the scorch mark in the air with her wingtip. Tivik crouched beside the helmet, reading the engraved words again and again. A new energy filled the room, not fear, but curiosity and respect. Professor Vrel stepped forward. Class, while you study, consider this. Every mark on this armor is a story, a lesson. Humans do not hide their past. They face it, learn from it, and sometimes use it to protect others. The students bowed their heads slightly, acknowledging the truth. Then, something unexpected happened. A small Virian student named Kellen, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly asked, "Mason, what would humans do if they saw someone from another species in danger? Would they risk themselves too?" Mason looked surprised for a moment, then he smiled gently. "My great-grandmother didn't protect humans only. She protected everyone she could. She believed that a life worth saving was a life, no matter what species it came from." The class murmured softly. The idea that humans would risk themselves for aliens was both comforting and astonishing. Professor Vrell stepped closer to Mason. "You have shown us something precious today. Something no lecture could teach." Mason looked down at the armor. She wanted people to learn. She didn't want war to be remembered for violence. She wanted it to be remembered for the people who tried to stop it. The room grew quiet again, not from fear, but from thought. Suddenly, a gentle chiming sound filled the room, the Academy announcement system. It signaled that the midterm presentations were officially beginning, and Professor Vrell needed to record Mason's grade. But instead of reaching for his tablet, Vrell turned to Mason with a calm smile. "I believe your presentation is already complete. Did I pass?" Mason asked softly. Vrell's smile widened. "You did more than pass. You taught this class what courage truly looks like." The students nodded in agreement. Some clapped gently. Others bowed, respectfully. Ralvek placed his clawed hand over his heart, a Karth gesture of honor. "Your ancestor is a warrior worthy of song," he said. Lyra fluttered her wings in a Varian sign of gratitude. "Thank you, Mason. This changed how I see humans." Tivik gave a small smile. "I used to think humans were reckless. Now I think you are hopeful." Quote, "Hopeful." Mason's eyes softened. That's what she wanted. For people to understand. Professor Vrell approached the armor once more. "Mason, may we leave the armor here for the day? I believe the class wants to learn more." "Of course," Mason said. "Just be careful." The students nodded and stepped back as he gently placed the helmet on top of the chest plate again. Even though the armor was cracked and damaged, it stood proudly on the table, an unspoken symbol of everything humans could become when pushed to their limits. That day, the armor did not teach fear. It taught hope. It taught loyalty. It taught sacrifice. And for the first time, the Galactic Academy truly understood why humans, despite their fragile bodies and chaotic emotions, were one of the most respected species in the galaxy. Not because of their strength, but because of their heart. The Academy's hallways buzzed with quiet excitement for the rest of the day. News of Mason's presentation spread faster than any assignment normally would. Students whispered in groups, trading their thoughts about the human armor, the sharp dents, the scorch marks, and the bravery of the woman who once wore it. Some students had seen artifacts from peaceful ceremonies, others from ancient rituals. But none had ever seen something that carried real history in such a heavy way. But inside Professor Vrell's classroom, the noise was gentle, almost respectful. After Mason left for a short break, many students stayed behind, standing around the armor as though it were a teacher itself. They asked questions to each other, pointed at different marks, and discussed what the human soldier must have felt in those moments. Lyra was the first to speak. "I didn't understand humans before," she admitted softly. "I thought they were unpredictable and too emotional. But this armor shows something else." Tivik nodded. "Humans feel things strongly, but they use those feelings to protect others." Ralvek folded his large arms across his chest. "Among Karth warriors, strength is measured by victories. But humans measure strength by how many lives they save." Professor Vrell listened to them quietly. It was rare to see students from different species agree so easily, especially about something as deep as courage and sacrifice. For once, there were no debates, no disagreements, only understanding. When Mason returned, he paused at the doorway. surprised to see how many students were still there. They looked up at him, and instead of stepping back in fear, they welcomed him with soft nods. "Mason," Lyra said gently. "We stayed because we wanted to understand more." He walked toward the table, stopping beside the armor, as if reuniting with an old friend. "Ask anything you want," he said. Tivik raised a hand nervously. "Do all humans carry stories like this? I mean, do all human families have heroes?" Mason shook his head. "Not in the way you think. Not all humans fight in wars, and not all of us have armor or history like this. But almost every human has someone in their family who taught them courage, even in small ways." "Small ways?" Lyra asked. Mason smiled. "Like helping others even when they're tired, standing up for someone who's scared, trying again after failing. Those things are not as dramatic as a battlefield, but they're still courage." The students murmured thoughtfully. They understood those things. They had never connected them with bravery before. Professor Vrel took a step forward. "Mason, I have a question as well. Why did your great-grandmother keep this armor in your family instead of donating it to a historical museum?" Mason looked down at the chest plate. His eyes softened. "She said museums could show the armor," he replied, "but families tell the stories. She wanted her children and grandchildren to know what it meant to fight for others. She believed that history isn't alive unless someone keeps its lessons close." The room fell silent again. The weight of his words settled gently, like dust after a long journey. After a moment, Ralvek asked, "What happened to her? After the battle, I mean." Mason took a slow breath. "She recovered. It took months, but she recovered. And after that, she spent the rest of her life teaching others how to avoid conflict, not how to win it." The students looked surprised. They had expected the armor to belong to someone who loved war. Instead, it belonged to someone who wanted peace. "My family says she believed peace was something you had to fight for," Mason added. "Not with weapons, but with understanding." Professor Vrel felt a warm respect fill his chest. He had taught hundreds of students from dozens of worlds, but never had he seen a lesson change the atmosphere of a classroom so deeply. The armor did not shout. It did not threaten. It simply existed, carrying memories that spoke louder than any speech. As the class continued talking, the academy's intercom hummed again. The voice of the administrative officer echoed through the halls. "Attention, students and faculty. The midterm exhibitions are now open in the central hall." Vrel smiled. "It seems our time is up. We should take your armor to the hall." "Mason, but it's heavy," Tivik said worriedly. Mason chuckled. To the class's surprise, Mason lifted the chest piece with practiced ease. It was still heavy, but he carried it carefully, as though he had learned how to handle it years ago. Lyra helped clear the table, and Ralvek pushed the wheeled platform closer. Together, the students helped prepare the setup. As they moved through the halls, other students stopped and stared. Some stepped back at first, intimidated by the armor's battle scars. Others leaned closer with curiosity. Whispers followed them. "Is that real human armor? Look at those marks. Is that burn damage? What happened to the soldier who wore it?" Mason answered questions gently, carefully, making sure no one felt afraid. He explained the meaning behind the armor, the purpose of each mark, and the lessons learned from every scar. By the time they reached the central hall, a small crowd had already formed. Professor Vrel stepped forward. "Clear a space," he said calmly. "This artifact holds important history." The students made room, and Mason placed the armor on a raised platform. The cracked helmet rested on top. The dim lights of the hall reflected faintly across its damaged surface, making the scars glimmer like metals. Soon, students from every department gathered: science, diplomacy, engineering, medicine. Even faculty members approached, curious, Some looked shocked, some looked uncertain, but none looked away. Finally, Professor Vrel spoke loudly enough for the crowd. "This," he said, "is not a symbol of violence. It is a symbol of protection. It is a story of a human who risked everything for people who could not defend themselves. Today, we honor not war, but the strength of compassion." The hall grew quiet. Mason placed his hand on the helmet one last time. "She didn't want to be remembered as a soldier," he said softly. "She wanted to be remembered as someone who helped." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of respect, full of reflection, full of understanding. One by one, students from different species approached the armor to look closer. Some bowed, some whispered words of gratitude. Others simply stood in awe of the courage displayed by a human they had never met but now felt connected to. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Professor Vrel turned to Mason. "You changed something today," he said. "Not with force, not with fear, but with truth." Mason nodded. "I think she would be happy with that." And as the lights of the central hall reflected softly off the battered armor, one thing became clear. Humanity's greatest strength was not power or technology. It was the quiet, unbreakable courage that lived in their hearts. A courage that echoed across worlds, across species, and now, across the halls of the Galactic Academy itself.